world of cable news screaming and social media echo chambers, it's easy to lose the signal in the noise. Every day, policy is debated, votes are cast, and your tax dollars are spent. We cut through the headlines to bring you the critical context you need, focusing on what's really going on in news and politics. Welcome to the Analytical Iowan Podcast. This is your daily dose of fact-driven politics. Let's analyze today's news. Here's Eric.
We are back on the Analytical Iowan Podcast. It is Saturday, December 6th, and recording this a lot later than I would like. Full disclosure, life got in the way. Working some different hours and ended up having to work later than I intended to or than I was scheduled to on Friday going into Saturday, and that affected what time I had to get up on Saturday. So I couldn't get up in time to record this morning like I wanted to, and I would have had this episode up much earlier today. But it is what it is, and here we go. We're going to get into everything. Now, we got a lot to talk about. First off, we got the big story that is still making headlines, and that is the double strike of these fishing boats. Now, MAGA is going to try to tell you that of course, that it was clearly a drug boat, and we know the difference. But again, the proper way to handle it is not to just blow them up in international water. There are rules to war. There are things we've agreed to by treaty. And there are things that if other countries did, we would hold them accountable for. And one of those things is you do not blow up boats in international waters unless you are in an active war situation. Now, we have not declared war on Venezuela. Well, officially. Donald Trump, of course, said you're going to find out that this is war. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But that's not a declaration of war, not the way it works. As I talk about a lot when it comes to how these boats should have been dealt with, is they should have been allowed to hit U.S. waters because they could, with all of our satellites and other tracking technology, I guarantee you they would have known the exact position of these boats, and they could have gotten them into U.S. water, had the Coast Guard find them, search the boat, confiscate the contraband, confiscate the illegal drugs, and then charge these people, put them through the criminal process. But no, Donald Trump, Pete Hegseth, and apparently certain members of the military are okay with being judge, jury, and executioner. So that's what they were doing. They just blew up these boats with no proof, with no evidence, and all we have is the word of Donald Trump that, yes, they were drug boats. And I'm sorry, I don't believe Donald Trump. I don't believe Pete Hegseth. Now, we've been hearing that there are two joint investigations going on into this situation with these boats. And with that going on, there's one in the House, one in the Senate. And I don't remember which one was doing the investigation. But Admiral Mitch Bradley was sitting there. And of course, I didn't know which way he would go with these testimonies. I didn't know if he was going to turn around and be full on Trump supporter or if he was going to actually, take a different stand and say, no, well, that really wasn't how we should have done things, but I was given a direct order by Pete Hegseth. He's basically falling on his own sword here, saying it was all him, that Pete Hegseth, never said kill them all, and any of that. He's basically just saying, I did it. I chose to complete the mission and blow this boat up. Now, what we are talking about is a boat, one of these supposed drug boats that is more than likely a fishing boat that was blown up coming up from Venezuela. And we don't even know for sure that it was headed toward the United States. But they decided to make this move, blew the boat up, and then when there were survivors, that were trying to just live at this point, clinging on to the wreckage of their now destroyed boat, they got blown up again and the job was finished. Now, why would they blow them up a second time? Well, no survivors for one, no mercy. Um, and in the rules of war, if this was a war, you are not allowed to kill unarmed and defenseless combatants. And if these were truly somebody we would view as a threat, in that way, while they were clinging to the side of the wreckage, trying to survive, they were not a threat. But MAGA, of course, is going to tell you, and even some Republican members of Congress for now are saying, well, what I saw was people who were uh, trying to flip the boat over and they were just going to continue the fight. But it seems like their boat wasn't in the shape to do any sort of fighting. We don't even have any evidence, and there's really been no reporting that they were firing on the United States vessels at all to warrant any kind of a response. But Pete Hegseth, Donald Trump don't really care. Now, this story is only gaining legs because there is some public interest in it, and now there is a bipartisan investigation in both chambers of Congress looking into it. Now, what could the outcome of this investigation be? Well, Pete Hegseth could be impeached, and it sounds like there could be democratically led articles of impeachment brought on the House floor by the end of the year. Now, whether or not Mike Johnson even allows them up for a vote is a good question. I don't know that he would. He would probably try to find some reason to weasel out of posting them up for a vote because why would you? If he could protect Pete Hegseth in this administration, why wouldn't he do just that? And say, no, I'm not going to put it up for a vote and just back off and say, nothing to see here, folks. It's all good. It's all cool. I could see him doing that. But if they have enough Republicans, and we don't know how many Republicans are on board, enough to get a bipartisan investigation going in the House of Representatives, but we don't know how many are overall on board with doing any of this, right? And if they bring it up for a vote in the House and they have the votes, and I think you're only going to see enough Republicans vote to move the articles of impeachment to the Senate if they already know they have the votes in the Senate to remove Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense. But would they? Maybe. Next year's an election year. Every member of the House of Representatives is up for grabs. They have to run for reelection every 2 years, like clockwork. None of them have any sort of guarantee that they would get reelected. Now, of course, you have some members of the House that are in what we would consider safe districts, but there's no guarantee that they actually win those races. And I'll get to that in a minute, too. So, do they remove Pete Hegseth if the public outcry is loud enough? Maybe. If they think it is going to work, it's entirely possible that Pete Hegseth gets removed. Beyond that, Donald Trump could ask for his resignation. Could he? Yes. Will he? I don't know. Maybe. Again, possible. That's the whole thing with this administration. So many things that are just possible. We don't know which way they're going to turn. Donald Trump is going to want to get away from this story. He's trying to find a way to deflect. And for somebody who would tell you he's the toughest man in the room, he's the smartest man in the room, he's in perfect cognitive health, you know, when asked about this report of the double strike, knew nothing about it. I don't know about that. I haven't been told about that. Did you know Pete Hegseth said to kill them all? Nope, never heard that. Didn't know anything about that. I don't think that's something Pete Hegseth would say. But it's not just this. Think about it. How many times has Donald Trump been asked a question about something controversial in the media? And usually his answer is, don't know anything about it. Never happened. But if it did happen, usually it's, well, somebody else did it first. Obama did it first. Obama did the same thing. They try to find some kind of a way to mix and match the whole thing to make it seem like what they're doing is just as bad as what other people are doing. That's a trademark narcissist playbook. Now, with this whole deal, does Donald Trump end up ultimately pardoning Pete Hegseth? Again, maybe. Does he gain anything from pardoning Pete Hegseth? No, not really. Doesn't gain anything. In fact, he may ultimately lose something if he pardons Pete Hegseth. Because right now, Pete Hegseth having criminal liability hanging over his head for these strikes, because let's just call it what it is. Some people want to say war crimes, but we're not at war. So it would fit the definition potentially of murder. Um, does that mean, if he doesn't get a deal, Pete Hegseth is having the criminal liability of a murder charge potentially hanging over his head? Now, I don't think Pam Bondi and this DOJ would charge Pete Hegseth with anything. I think they would ultimately give him a pass. However, murder charges have no statute of limitations. So when he is gone, when Donald Trump is no longer in power, um, Pete Hegseth could be dealing with the fact that he has to ultimately pay the price, and the next attorney general may end up investigating Pete Hegseth and looking at it. So if Donald Trump pardons him, of course, that all goes away. And it can be a preemptive pardon, right? You don't have to be charged with anything criminal to get a presidential pardon. And you can blanket pardon a whole group of people. But see, once you've been pardoned, then you go ahead. You no longer have the protections of the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. When you say, I plead the Fifth, you're invoking your right to not incriminate yourself. And when you have been pardoned for that crime that they are looking at, in this case, it would be for murder charges from blowing up these boats. If he were to get a pardon from Donald Trump, he would have no criminal liability hanging over his head. So when these bipartisan investigations come rolling through, uh, he'd have no choice but to answer. He could not plead the Fifth because the pardon would be saving his butt and protecting him from having any future harm. The only thing else that would happen would be an impeachment because there's no criminal penalties for impeachment. It's all political. So does Donald Trump pardon Pete Hegseth? I don't know. Maybe. It depends on if he thinks there's something in it and something he can gain. Because we know Donald Trump is all about doing things that make himself money or make himself rich, or that he gains something of significance out of it. Now, I mentioned Donald Trump made comments, and he was asked by a reporter point blank about this whole situation, if he supported uh, Pete Hegseth blowing up these boats and issuing the double tap and saying, well, eliminate them all, kill them all. And Donald Trump says, well, you're going to find out that this is war, and how many people have they killed with their poison that they're peddling in the United States, and just went on a rant trying to prove that these people were running drugs. But of course, Donald Trump says things without a lot of proof. And we're just supposed to take the word of Donald Trump that it's legitimate, that is what is going on. And I'm sorry, I don't trust Donald Trump. I trust him about as far as I can throw him. Which, let's be honest, I'm not in the best of shape. That ain't very far. But Donald Trump says, you're going to find out that this is war. Well, Donald, you can't declare war. You need Congress to do that. And we can't declare war on groups of people. Not really. Because you're saying it's, drug cartels. But in order to declare war, we'd have to declare war on Venezuela because that's where you claim they're at. None of it makes any sense. Donald Trump is sundowning in real time, and it is horrible here. He is not doing well, and he's just saying shit at this point. Now, is Congress going to declare war in Venezuela? Probably not. In fact, they have been looking at trying to pass multiple different resolutions eliminating Donald Trump's ability to use the military for things in Venezuela without consulting Congress. Ultimately, Congress has the power to declare war, and we have not actively declared war since December 6th, 1941. I think it was actually December 8th, 1941, but because of December 6th, 1941. Wait, no, I'm wrong. December 7th, 1941, which would be the anniversary would be tomorrow of Pearl Harbor, because it was the very next day. But we haven't actually declared war since then, since Pearl Harbor. And that brought us into World War II. Since then, we've been involved in major conflicts, but we've never been actually in an open war. Even Afghanistan and Iraq weren't full wars. We had they had military authorization to do those things, and for all intents and purposes, it was. But Congress stopped short of declaring a war. Now, Donald Trump wants to be known as the peace president, but yet he's coming out renaming the Department of Defense the Department of War. He's renaming a whole bunch of things, but he wants to go back to being the War Department. And but he still wants to be known as the man of peace. And now he's saying that this thing with Venezuela is we're going to find out that it is war. And he's talking about doing land strikes here soon. It's bad enough that we're blowing things up in the water and killing people. What's going to happen if he starts doing actual strikes against Venezuela? Here's the problem. Much like us, Venezuela has allies. Okay. If we go in and we start doing all sorts of things with Venezuela, their allies, and some of them are the same people, but their allies may come to their defense. And now we've got multiple countries pissed off at us. And of course, this thing's going to escalate. And then we have to go against all of their allies. And then we would call in all of the favors for all of our allies. And if some of them are the same, saying, hey, well, you're also our ally, you just need to stay out of it then and be neutral. And this is one of the things that could lead to a world war. Now, if you know your history, um, one of the things that led up to World War One, and World War One is complicated and it's messy, but effectively, a whole bunch of European countries all had treaties with each other. And when you had the killing of Archduke Ferdinand, it basically set off a firestorm. I think he was Austrian. I think I could be wrong there. But anyway, he dies. And another country's blamed. So those two countries go to war. Then their ally gets involved, and then the next ally gets involved, and back and forth. And pretty soon you have all of Europe basically involved, and it becomes one big giant mess. And that's what could happen here. But it led by Donald Trump trying to prove he's the tough guy, going after these supposed drug dealers in Venezuela. Now, I'm hearing some people say that Venezuela has a lot of oil, and that could be it. And it wouldn't surprise me. That also wouldn't be the first time a Republican president in my lifetime has started a war in a foreign country over oil. Say what you want about the invasion of Iraq, but I think oil had a lot to do with the invasion of Iraq. I think George W. Bush wanted to get access to the oil for American markets, and he also wanted to complete what his dad had started with Desert Storm in Kuwait uh, way back in the late 80s. Um, the whole thing, if we go into Venezuela, if it does become a war, yeah, that would take Congress. I don't know that Congress has the want to declare war on Venezuela, but Donald Trump is looking for something, right? It makes a good distraction from the Epstein files. It makes a good distraction from the economy being what it is and everything becoming more expensive and all of it. And he has this belief because of a conversation he had had with Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine, another war he had promised he could end in 24 hours and is still going on a year later, um, that he could stay in power. See, Zelensky, his term is up, but Ukraine's constitution has a thing that says if we are in active war, we don't hold elections, and that they'd only hold elections when it's safe to do so. And until that point, Zelensky gets to remain in power as president. So Donald Trump, when he hears this, well, oh, you got to stay in power because you're at war. Well, maybe we should look into that. And he's using it as an idea for how to get uh, his term extended. Right? He thinks he is going to be healthy enough to be around after 2028, after the midterms, or not the midterms, after the general in 28, when the next president is going to be sworn in. If you'd ask Donald Trump who the front runner is for that race, he would tell you himself because he believes his own hype. He thinks he is going to be able to last long enough to be president in 2028. But Donald Trump thinks he's going to be healthy enough to make it to 2028. I don't think so. I think we are seeing him sundowning in real time. You notice his late night tweets and his, Truth Social binges where he's up for 3 and 4 hours at a time, firing off stuff at a post a minute, sometimes resharing the same thing 3 and 4 times, like somebody who doesn't know how to use social media. Donald Trump is having multiple problems. So, with all of his health concerns, we have the sundowning problems where he is tweeting in the middle of the night and posting all of this stuff. Um, you know, that being awake and active like that, it is a sign of somebody who potentially has had mental problems like a stroke, maybe suffering from dementia. You see this a lot in older people where there hits a point in the night where they're just up. If they don't get to bed, they are up the rest of the night. And this happens frequently for Donald Trump anymore. Now, you would think, as president of the United States, you'd be starting your day super early. Maybe getting up and going between 5 and 6 a.m. That way you're up before 8 a.m. And for somebody who used to be big in the business world, you would think he would want to be up and going before 8 or 9. That would be the typical start of most business days, but not Donald Trump. Now we're hearing because he does these late night tweet sessions and stuff, and he's up all hours of the night, that he doesn't even start his day till about 10:30, and they don't do official business till about noon. And well, they're done by 5 or 6 most days. They only usually have one or two big things that are showy. They're propping him up, right? They're trying to extend how long he can be viable for. Because whatever cocktails of stuff they are giving him to make him as coherent as he currently is only going to work so far. Now, I say it that way because Donald Trump's not very coherent right now. If you look at what's going on, he does not form complete sentences anymore. Not really. He doesn't usually get to a point. Now, he thinks he's weaving this all together in some big tapestry where he'll start talking about one thing, switch to 6 different topics, and get back to his original point 5 minutes later. And he thinks he's just brilliant. Now, Donald Trump's far from brilliant, and most of what he comes up with can be debunked, but he keeps repeating the same claims. Beyond that, you got to look at Donald Trump's health. Donald Trump's health is not good. You add in what we were just talking about, the sundowning. Then you got the fact that he is dragging one of his feet. He's been videotaped, and I know that's an old term from an old person, but he's been recorded numerous times uh, dragging his one foot or making it at least it looks like he's dragging his foot. You have all of these health issues. We have the MRI that we don't know what was actually scanned, and then the fake summary that he released. And I believe that is a fully fake summary because it doesn't sound like something a medical professional would write. It sounds like something Donald Trump would dictate. It reminded me of Bill Barr talking about the Mueller report. And uh, when Mueller was looking into the ties of Russia into the 2016 election, they came out and said Russia was attempting to uh, influence the 2016 election because having Donald Trump as president would be a more favorable outcome for them. But they also came out and said yes, uh, that this is where Donald Trump is correct, that there was no direct collusion between the two. But Robert Mueller also said in his report that there were numerous instances of times where Donald Trump had obstructed justice, and the only reason he wasn't charged for those obstructions was because he was the sitting president of the United States. But you get Bill Barr reading the summary of his report and comes out and basically says, yeah, it was all a hoax. The Trump campaign and Russia were not colluding together. End of story. Donald Trump not being charged. It was a very phony, a very bogus um, situation there. And that's what this deal on Donald Trump's health sounded like. Now, Donald Trump wants us to believe he is in great shape. He's not. He talks about taking cognitive tests all the time. And the fact that he's taken more than one and doesn't realize what he is taking is pretty telling. One of the last times he talked about taking a cognitive test, he actually called it an IQ test and he said it was very challenging. Now, of course, what he was actually talking about was the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, where that is something they give to you when they suspect dementia, stroke, Alzheimer's, any of those things, maybe even a traumatic brain injury, um, something maybe worse than a concussion, or maybe after a very severe concussion or some other kind of head trauma, where they'll have you do things like draw a clock face. And it's not about your artistic style. It's just, can you orientate the clock the correct way? If you don't, do you realize there's a problem, etc.? Or do you draw something that is completely wrong and it makes you look, and you look at it and you go, yeah, that's right. It's an idea of getting a baseline for where you are mentally. And the fact that he's taken more than one means that they're looking for something. Now, maybe it is nothing, and they just think the fact that he's under all this stress and he is an old man and he is rambling a lot, maybe that's all the only reason they needed to look into it for him. We don't know. But the fact is, they did do it. And Donald Trump admits that they were looking into him, but he doesn't know what they were looking at for the MRI, and he doesn't know that this is a Montreal cognitive assessment and what it was for. I guarantee you the people around him told him that it was a IQ test. It was an IQ test. I guarantee it. I guarantee you that's what they told him because that's the only way they were going to get him to take it. Now, with all the things wrong with Donald Trump and his health, he still wants us to believe he's going to be viable come 2028. And people are worried about Donald Trump having a third term. First of all, Donald Trump having a third term is not going to happen. It's just not. The Constitution specifically prohibits a person from being elected to the office of president more than twice. Donald Trump has been elected president more than or at two times. Come January 20th, 2029, Donald Trump will be out of office at the absolute latest. At the latest. Now, Donald Trump has talked about trying to run for a third term, and they've got some theories about it. One of the things we've heard people say is, well, Donald Trump's just going to run as JD Vance as vice president, and then JD would resign, and oh, he gets 4 more years. That's not how that works. The 12th Amendment says if you are ineligible to be president, you are ineligible to be vice president. It was correcting an oversight in the U.S. Constitution because we do have some limitations as to who can be president. Now, there are currently only three. You must be 35 years old. You must be a natural born U.S. citizen. And you must have not already served 2 terms. Well, Donald Trump will be term limited come January 20th, 2029. His 2 terms will be up. And because he is ineligible based on that 2 term limit, he cannot run for president or for vice president as JD Vance's running mate. Okay. And that whole idea of running JD Vance just to abdicate in favor of Donald Trump is stupid on its face. It really is. If Republicans, if that's the only way they can win, there is a problem there. And they got to look at what they're doing because if they can't win anybody else with anything else or anybody else, they are going to need to retool. They are going to need to rebrand. Now, does JD Vance run in 28? Possibly. He's the current front runner, but he's also not well liked. MAGA doesn't trust him. MAGA doesn't like him. The biggest way for them to accept JD Vance would be for something to happen to Donald Trump. If he were to, pass on, then they could turn around and maybe he could become some kind of a hero. Now, the other thing we're hearing that he may be trying to do to shore up his image. And this looks bizarre from the outside. And again, because it's Donald Trump and people connected to Donald Trump, it makes you scratch your head and go, well, could it be? And that is the story that his wife, Usha Vance, and him are not doing well. Usha has been seen publicly multiple times now, not wearing a wedding ring, attending varying events, and she's claiming it is simple oversight. Um, and then you have this story about how JD Vance keeps getting mentioned by Erica Kirk. And some people are suggesting, and this it almost sounds like a conspiracy theory, but again, because Donald Trump's involved, because the current party, the way the Republicans are currently operating, because they're involved, that Usha Vance and JD Vance could split, and that between now and whenever Donald Trump finally ends up leaving the presidency, JD Vance could marry Erica Kirk. That would shore up his uh, image with the Republican voter base. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen. It's kind of a wild story, but it's something to watch because if there is movement there, they are making a play. Now, like I said, JD Vance is not well liked. And a lot of people are scared of JD Vance. Now, what I'm going to say about JD Vance being president, there's going to be several things that happen if JD Vance becomes president. One, he's going to clean house, right? And I think he'll be president before the end of Donald Trump's term. And he's going to clean house in the cabinet. There's going to be a lot of people gone. I don't think JD Vance ends up keeping around people like RFK Jr. I don't think he keeps around Kash Patel, Christy Nome, people like that. I just don't. I don't think they do. I think JD Vance brings in more qualified people, but depending on how Donald Trump goes out, JD Vance is also going to be looking over his shoulder. Imagine we've got so many things falling down on Donald Trump right now. You've got this double strike problem. You've got the economy not doing nearly as well as what they want us to believe, and you've got the Epstein files. Now, any one of those could be a vehicle for the Republicans to move away from Donald Trump. Maybe not so much the economy because they want us to believe the economy is doing well, and the only way to believe it is if you have somebody like Donald Trump constantly telling that lie that yeah, the economy's doing great when it's not. So, um, if they move away from Donald Trump, if they impeach and remove him, or JD Vance has to use the 25th, unless it is painfully obvious that there is something wrong, like he has a major cardiac event or a stroke or something on national TV. Because where is Donald Trump the happiest? When the cameras are on him. If something like that were to happen and MAGA didn't have a choice, um, then JD would have an easier time taking over the party. But as we talk about a lot, one of the problems is if JD Vance tries to take over the party, well, Donald Trump is still halfway. Uh, I would say rational, but that's not the word I'm looking for. Halfway cognitive, where he can still talk and he can understand what's going on around him. He will try to burn JD Vance down around him. It won't be close. It won't be pretty because Donald Trump does not like disloyalty, and that's what he would view this as is nothing but disloyalty. So he would burn the Republican Party down in his wake when they try if they try him uh, in the Senate and they convict him and they with an impeachment and he is removed. He would go to Truth Social, he would go to Twitter and try to rant and rave and take the Republicans out with him. Now, uh, Donald Trump is desperate to not have that happen. He doesn't want to have to deal with trying to burn the Republican Party down. He just wants his way. He wants them to give in. And for the most part, they are. But Donald Trump, if they decide to burn him, is going to burn down the Republican Party. I keep saying it, but it's true. He will unleash whatever information he has on whoever he has information on, and he is going to try to publicly embarrass them, shame them, etc. Look at what happened to Marjorie Taylor Greene. Donald Trump was desperate to not have the Epstein files released. In fact, it came out, and I still think the Epstein files are going to be a way for the Republicans to get rid of Donald Trump. But Marjorie Taylor Greene has been talking about how she's been pushing for the files since before they released the discharge petition. She was one of the people who signed that discharge petition to have the files released. And when they were dealing with all of it, she said, we have to release someone in this and that. And Donald Trump apparently called her, trying to pressure her to release her vote, and said, well, if you release those files, people are going to get hurt. Well, yeah, people could get hurt, but they're not people I would care about as to whether or not they get hurt. And that is the clients of Jeffrey Epstein. A lot of information is going to be made public at some point. We are on the clock. But Donald Trump was putting pressure on Marjorie Taylor Greene, saying, well, people are going to get hurt. Yeah, what people, Donnie? People close to you, your friends, your social group? Remember what you said about Palm Beach in the 90s, that we don't know what Palm Beach was like in the 90s. Well, if it was anything like everywhere I lived in the 90s, doing things to kids was not considered socially acceptable. And that's really what was going on there. It wasn't necessarily underage girls. They were kids. They weren't women. They weren't young women. They were kids. But yeah, they were teenagers, and that the Republicans are going to try to make it sound like that's better, but it's not. Um, and we don't entirely know all of what was going on. And in no case was, in at least in anywhere I lived, was that considered acceptable. But according to Donald Trump, you don't know what Palm Beach was like in the 90s. I don't think it matters, except when you're in a social circle of people who had a lot of money, which is where Donald Trump was, or at least he tried to be. He never really fit into that social group because they saw right through him. They saw what he was like. So I think they're going to use the Epstein files to get rid of Donald Trump at some point. And we're going to get a swath of new information on those Epstein files coming up here soon. Now, what am I talking about? Well, there is grand jury testimony that is going to be released out of Palm Beach. And this grand jury testimony is going to be from the first set of charges that were brought against Jeffrey Epstein. And if they would have pushed through with those charges, they would have taken Jeffrey Epstein out of the game about a decade before he ultimately ended up in prison. Now, there's multiple reasons as to why they didn't. The biggest being once they started investigating and as they had stuff on Epstein, they realized this was a much bigger case than what they thought and decided they turned everything from this case over to the DOJ and let them go after it. And they dropped the ball. And that would have been, I think, 2007 or 2008. That would have been George W. Bush's DOJ going into the Obama administration. But they dropped the ball with it. They didn't do enough with it. They didn't push and go after these charges. Well, because all information in this case is now required by law to be turned over to the public in a searchable format, a judge has signed off on releasing grand jury transcripts and all evidence and transcripts of things that were talked about in the grand jury will be released. Now, normally, they don't do that. Normally, the things brought up in the grand jury are uh, kept under seal. Now, in a grand jury, when you're trying to bring charges, you're not going for a conviction. You're not out there to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person did this crime. You're just trying to tip the scale and say, well, is there enough evidence here that more than likely a crime was committed? So, not even all of your best evidence is going to be in the grand jury testimony. But when they look at that, they're going to look at this grand jury information and go, what is in there? What didn't we know before, etc. And all of this stuff is stuff that was in possession of the DOJ. Now, like I said, these were from state level charges. These were from his first arrest uh, almost a decade before he died in prison. And some of this stuff we may have never seen the light of day before, but the judge ruled that because everything that is in the DOJ's possession, including this information, by law now needs to be released coming up on the 19th, that it is okay to release these grand jury transcripts. And this could signal some of the other cases, which I know there are several in New York trying to get grand jury information released there as well. Now that this judge has ruled on it, that judge could rule on it. Now, I don't know if the administration is going to attempt to appeal this decision or not. And they might just because they don't want the files released. They are doing everything they can to prevent it, even though they have tried in other cases to get the Epstein files released. And then when the judge says, well, we can't do that, well, then they could say, well, see, the court prevented me from releasing that information. And that's a problem for Donald Trump. Like he is looking for a way out, right? And the fact that now a judge is saying, well, yeah, we can release the grand jury transcripts, that's just going to be more stuff to dig through. And I think they are going to be released here in the early parts of next week. And we're going to be digging through it, trying to figure out what's in there, who's in there, etc. How big and bad is all this information? And Donald Trump doesn't want any of that smoke. He doesn't want to deal with it. But Ultimately, he's going to have to. And as this information comes out, and as we find out more and more about what is going on with Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, he is going to get more and more terrified. Donald Trump knows how bad the information about himself is that's in there. Whether he admits that he did anything actually wrong, I have no idea. Whether or not um, he will recognize that he needs to atone for the things he has done, probably not. Um, but he knows the implications to his image from being connected to Jeffrey Epstein. And he's looking for a way out there. Now, Republicans could potentially use Donald Trump's being connected to Epstein in the files as a way to get rid of Donald Trump. Because one of the reasons they haven't walked away from Donald Trump yet is because of that 30 to 35% of the Republican base that is hardcore MAGA. That they are looking for a way to keep that voting base with them as they still kick Donald Trump out of the party, because a good chunk of that base would not vote for anybody unless it is Donald Trump or it's somehow connected to Trump or something like that. Now, uh, when the Republicans decide to make that move and they decide to move on Donald Trump with the files, I think you could see Republicans leading the charge and drafting articles of impeachment against Pete Hegseth, or Pete Hegseth. I still got that on my mind from before, against Donald Trump, uh, like I was talking about with Pete Hegseth. But I don't think they would do that unless they knew they already had the votes in the Senate, like I've talked about before, to actually remove him. Now, of course, they could go ahead and they could uh, ultimately try to offer him a deal that, hey, you know what, you go ahead and resign, let us move forward to JD Vance, and we would do that, and you get a pardon from Vance. Here's the thing: JD Vance, no guarantee that Vance would actually do the pardon. He probably would, if the leaders of the Republican Party told him to. But Donald Trump is a narcissist. Taking a pardon would mean he'd have to admit he did something wrong. He will never do that. Now, maybe if he wasn't suffering some of the signs that he is having mental problems, he's fighting dementia and all of that. Maybe if he was in the right state of mind, you could talk him into the idea of making a final move. Okay, you resign. We just like Nixon, JD Vance will pardon you, and then you can go spend the last years of whatever life you have left, not having to worry with that these charges and stuff are coming against you. But Donald Trump is not in his right mind. We've been talking about the fact that he is suffering from dementia, things like that, and he may not see the wisdom or the logic in that. And of course, expecting Donald Trump to understand wisdom and logic are, it's a pretty good stretch anyway. Now, one of the last things we can talk about is this gerrymandering case from Texas. Now, you may recall Texas is gerrymandering the hell out of their state. They are trying to eliminate 5 democratically controlled seats in the state of Texas. Okay. By moving parts of their population around from district to district. Now, what happened is there was a lawsuit over this gerrymandering, and normally we do not gerrymander mid-decade. We do it after the census on the decade year. So the next one would be 2020. After they compile that information in 2031, you look at the census, figure out where the population is, and all of the information from the census, and then you redraw your maps every 10 years. And that's part of how they figure out, which states get extra senators or members of the House, which states lose representation, all of it. That's how it all happens, is on the 10th. Well, or on the year after the decade, I mean. And what they're doing here is that they're doing it ahead, right? Trying to get rid of these uh, 5 Democratic seats. Well, there was a court case where they got sued. The state of Texas got sued, and a lower court ruled that these maps were racially drawn and they were illegal. Well, U.S. Supreme Court steps in and says, "Yeah, we're going to put a stay on that temporarily. We're going to pause that lower court's order while we consider this full thing on the merits." And you know, so for right now, you can plan to use these newly drawn maps in 2026, which is a loss for Democrats in Texas. However, it might not be as big of a loss as you think. Well, first of all, it's a win in California because there's a good chance that if Texas gets to keep its newly drawn maps, that California gets to keep its newly drawn maps. That's going to basically offset on the federal level these two states. But how is it a win for Democrats in Texas? Well, let's look at Tennessee. Tennessee just had a special election. Now, we were all disappointed that Afton Bain did not win her election bid, and she lost by about just under 9 percentage points. Okay. Now, Donald Trump carried this district with 22 points, which means you are talking about uh, something like, what would it be, 62 to 62, not 62, 38, 68, 34 or something like that, like by a huge margin, right? Well, Afton Bain shrunk that margin down to just under 9 percentage points. And these districts in Texas, what they're trying to do is take the Republican voting base down by about that. So instead of winning by 65% of the voters in that district, they're still going to win with 55%. Okay. But if Afton Bain can switch 13% of Republicans in her district, if other Democrats run that same margin, you could start potentially keeping seats for the Democrats that are going to run in the heavily gerrymandered area. That those seats could still stay Democrat, or they could maybe flip some Republican-led seats, and all because they shrunk out their voter base to try to win more seats, is what Republicans did, all while shoring up Democrats. And now, if Democrats think there is actually a chance to win, they may actually turn up and vote, and they may also start running in some of these districts where they had figured there's no need to run. Republican always wins. And that's half the problem. Democrats have an issue when it comes to certain things. There should not be a single race for the House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate that ever runs unopposed at all. Republicans need to be afraid of Democrats ending up running to outseat them. It shouldn't be gimme seats, and both parties have those areas where it is very uncompetitive, and the other party just says, "Yeah, I'm not going to try anymore." And we really shouldn't have that. Democrats should get out and put in the work and try to get a representative in every district. And if in a lot of these districts, not just counting Texas, but in a lot of these districts, if you look at the margins of victory, there are dozens of House seats held currently by Republicans where they won by less than 13% of the vote. If these kind of trends that I'm seeing on the numbers end up holding, where you can see like people like Afton Bain winning by or gaining 13 percentage points, if other Democrats also pick up 13 percentage points, tons of seats are going to flip. And then as far as Afton Bain having her election, she is also going to be running again, potential to be the nominee for the Democrats in 2028. Now, assuming Afton Bain ends up being the nominee for the Democrats I said 28, I meant 26 in the midterms. If Afton Bain ends up running next year, she can look at everything that this Van Epps has done since being elected and say, okay, well, here's what he promised, here's what he did, here's what he promised, here's what he did, and run a very serious campaign and maybe have a chance on his own record to beat Van Epps as far as showing that he's unqualified for the position and all the bad choices he made. All right, so that's going to do it for this later episode of the Analytical Iowan podcast. I want to thank you for taking the time to join me today. I do apologize for it being out late, but life got in the way. Hopefully tomorrow's episode will be out much earlier, and you can enjoy that one as well. So I'll be back tomorrow. We always have stuff to talk about, and I want to thank you for joining me.
That was Eric. That does it for our analysis today. If you appreciated us cutting through the noise to get to the critical context, please make sure you're subscribed to the Analytical Iowan podcast on Spotify and YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.